What would you do if your enemy built a bomber that could fly higher than your best fighters could reach, faster than your interceptors could catch, and carried more bombs than anything you'd ever seen in the sky? Most military leaders would scramble to develop countermeasures, rush upgraded fighters into production, or seriously consider negotiating for peace before the situation became hopeless. But when the first B-29 Superfortress appeared over Tokyo on November 24, 1944, flying serenely at 30,000 feet, while Japanese fighters clawed desperately to reach 25,000, dropping bombs with devastating precision from altitudes where anti-aircraft guns fired blindly into empty sky, and then disappearing back toward the Marianas, faster than anything in the Japanese arsenal could intercept them. Air defense commanders realized with cold horror that 4 years of meticulous preparation, thousands of anti-aircraft guns, and hundreds of fighter aircraft had become instantly completely obsolete. The Japanese were supremely confident too. Their integrated air defense network was considered the most sophisticated in Asia, refined through years of combat experience against Chinese bombers and early American air raids. With early warning radar systems developed, with German technical assistance, searchlight networks that could illuminate the night sky, and fighter squadrons whose pilots had survived brutal combat in China and the Pacific. After all, how could any bomber, no matter how advanced, survive against a defense system that had been specifically designed and continuously improved to destroy aircraft? But the Japanese didn't know about American engineering ambition, and they certainly didn't expect that this single aircraft design, costing more than the Manhattan Project that would create the atomic bomb, would not only render their entire air defense infrastructure useless, but systematically destroy their industrial capacity city by city, break their civilian population's will to continue fighting, and make the continuation of the war physically impossible, all before the atomic bombs ever fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This is the story of how the B-29 Superfortress represented such a quantum leap in aviation technology that it made existing air defense systems obsolete overnight. Why Japanese fighters couldn't stop it, even when they knew exactly where it was going and had hours to prepare their interception. And how American engineering created a weapon so devastating that it changed not just the outcome of the Pacific War, but the entire concept of strategic air power forever. The B-29 Superfortress wasn't just another aircraft in America's vast arsenal of weapons. It was the single most expensive military program of World War II, costing approximately $3 billion, which exceeded even the cost of developing the atomic bomb, and represented a financial gamble that would have bankrupted most nations if the aircraft had failed to perform. By late 1944, this massive silver bomber represented the pinnacle of American industrial capability and technological ambition, incorporating advances in metallurgy, engine design, pressurization systems, and weapons control that pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible in aviation engineering. Every B-29 that rolled off production lines in Kansas, Nebraska, and Georgia embodied thousands of innovations and represented America's determination to win the war through technological superiority rather than just material quantity. But everything changed in the summer of 1944, when American Marines and soldiers paid in blood to capture the Mariana Islands of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, suffering thousands of casualties to secure bases that would bring the Japanese home islands within range of the B-29 for the first time in the war. The strategic plan was breathtaking in its ambition and terrifying in its implications for Japan. Operation Matterhorn had begun earlier from bases in China and India, but the Marianas-based campaign would be different, systematic, sustained, and utterly devastating, designed to destroy Japan's war-making capacity through strategic bombing that would eliminate their ability to produce aircraft, build ships, refine oil, or manufacture the weapons needed to continue fighting. What made the B-29's deployment so revolutionary was that it represented advances in virtually every aspect of aviation technology simultaneously. The pressurized cabin meant crews could operate in comfort at altitudes where previous bomber crews would have been incapacitated by cold and oxygen deprivation. The remote-controlled gun turrets, operated through an advanced analog computing system, allowed a single gunner to control multiple weapons positions and engage attacking fighters with unprecedented accuracy. The Wright R-3350 engines, despite their temperamental nature and tendency to catch fire, provided power that made the B-29 faster than most Japanese fighters at altitude and gave it a combat radius exceeding 1,600 miles with a significant bomb load. The critical moment came in November 1944 when the first B-29s began their systematic bombing campaign from newly constructed airfields on Tinian and Saipan, forcing Japanese military leadership to confront a strategic nightmare they had no solution for. If Japan couldn't stop the B-29 raids, and every analysis suggested they couldn't, their major industrial cities would be systematically destroyed. Their aircraft production would cease, their oil refineries would burn, and their ability to sustain military forces in the field would collapse regardless of how many soldiers they had, or how determined those soldiers were to fight to the death. The situation was desperate in ways that transcended normal military calculations, because the B-29 wasn't just attacking military targets, it was attacking the fundamental industrial base that made modern warfare possible. And Japanese air defenses, designed and built to counter conventional medium bombers like the B-17 and B-24, were simply incapable of stopping this new threat. To understand how the B-29 made Japanese air defenses obsolete, you must understand the revolutionary nature of the aircraft itself and the almost reckless ambition that went into its creation. The genesis of the Superfortress began in 1939 when the Army Air Corps issued a specification for a super-heavy bomber that seemed to demand the impossible, an aircraft that could fly farther, higher, faster, and carry more bombs than anything that had ever been built, all while protecting its crew and defending itself against fighter attacks. Boeing's response to this specification was a design so radical, so far beyond existing aviation technology, that even the engineers creating it weren't entirely certain it could be built, much less flown safely in combat. The competition between Boeing, Lockheed, Consolidated, and Douglas to win the contract produced some of the most advanced aircraft designs of the era. But Boeing's Model 345 proposal stood out for its sheer audacity, incorporating technologies that existed only in experimental form and making promises about performance that seemed wildly optimistic. When Boeing won the contract in September 1940, they inherited not just a development challenge, but a $3 billion gamble that would consume more resources than any other weapons program in history except the atomic bomb. The technical specifications that emerged from Boeing's Wichita, Kansas facility read like science fiction to pilots and engineers accustomed to conventional bombers. 4 Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone engines, each producing 2,200 horsepower through 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, gave the B-29 a total of 8,800 horsepower, driving 4 massive propellers. The aircraft measured 141 feet from wingtip to wingtip and stretched 99 feet from nose to tail, creating an airframe large enough to carry 20,000 pounds of bombs on short-range missions, or 5,000 pounds across its maximum combat radius of 1,600 miles. Maximum speed reached 357 miles per hour, fast enough to outrun many Japanese fighters at altitude, while cruising speed of 290 miles per hour meant the B-29 could cover vast distances efficiently. Most remarkably, the service ceiling of 31,150 feet put the Superfortress above the effective operating altitude of virtually every Japanese fighter aircraft and beyond. The reach of most anti-aircraft artillery. What truly made the B-29 revolutionary, however, wasn't just its size or speed, but the integration of technologies that had never been combined in a single aircraft before. The pressurized cabin was the most visible innovation, allowing the crew of 11 men to operate at extreme altitudes without oxygen masks, heavy flight suits, or the physical exhaustion that plagued crews of unpressurized bombers. Flying at 30,000 feet in a B-29 meant working in shirt-sleeve comfort while the outside air temperature dropped to 40 degrees below zero, and the atmospheric pressure would have killed unprotected humans within minutes. This pressurization didn't just improve crew comfort, it dramatically increased operational effectiveness, because men who weren't fighting hypoxia, frostbite, and exhaustion could perform their duties with far greater precision and efficiency. The remote-controlled gun turret system represented another quantum leap in defensive armament technology, Previous bombers required gunners to physically man their weapons, exposed to wind, cold, and enemy fire, with each gunner operating independently and covering a specific arc of the aircraft. The B-29 system was radically different, using an advanced analog computer to calculate lead angles, compensate for aircraft motion and target movement, and allow a single gunner, sitting in a pressurized sighting station, to control multiple turrets simultaneously. 4 Browning M250 caliber machine guns occupied each of the 4 remote turrets, 2 on top of the fuselage and 2 on the bottom, creating interlocking fields of fire that covered virtually every approach angle. The tail position, the only manually operated gun station, mounted a 20mm cannon specifically designed to destroy fighters attempting rear attacks. This system meant that Japanese fighters couldn't find a safe angle of attack. Every approach brought them into the field of fire of multiple 50 caliber guns directed by computing, systems that made American gunners far more accurate than their Japanese counterparts. But the development of this technological marvel was anything but smooth, and the story of bringing the B-29 from design to operational status reads like a chronicle of near disasters and desperate improvisation. The Wright R-3350 engines, powerful as they were, had a terrifying tendency to catch fire without warning, incinerating aircraft during test flights and killing test crews with horrifying regularity. Weight problems plagued the program from the beginning, with each design iteration adding pounds that eroded performance and required constant redesigning of structures and systems. The pressurization system failed repeatedly during testing, explosive decompressions at altitude that could have killed entire crews if they'd occurred in combat. Production began before testing was complete, a calculated risk driven by war urgency that meant the first operational B-29s were still being modified and improved even as they flew combat missions. Boeing's Wichita facility became the site of what employees called the Battle of Kansas, a massive production effort that required solving unprecedented manufacturing challenges while simultaneously training crews to fly an aircraft more complex than anything they'd experienced. Crashes continued throughout 1943 and into early 1944, killing experienced pilots and air crews, raising serious questions about whether the B-29 program would succeed at all, or whether $3 billion had been spent on an aircraft too advanced for its own good. But the alternative was unacceptable. Without the B-29, there was no way to strike Japan's home islands effectively, no way to implement strategic bombing doctrine that American planners believed could win the war without a catastrophically costly invasion of Japan itself, and no way to demonstrate the kind of technological superiority that might convince Japanese leadership that continued resistance was futile. What the B-29 represented was something that challenged the fundamental assumptions of how air defense systems were designed and how they could protect a nation from strategic bombing. The concept that a single aircraft type could render an entire nation's defensive infrastructure obsolete seemed impossible until American strategic bombing. Theorists began to understand what happened when you combined altitude capability, speed, range, and defensive firepower in ways that previous aircraft had never achieved. When General Curtis LeMay and his staff analyzed Japanese air defenses in late 1944, they recognized something that Japanese commanders were only beginning to understand with growing horror. The defensive system protecting Japan's home islands had been designed to counter threats that no longer represented America's primary bombing capability. American strategic bombing theory, developed during the interwar period by air power advocates like Billy Mitchell and refined through combat experience in Europe, rested on several core assumptions that the B-29 was specifically designed to validate. The belief that precision high-altitude bombing could destroy an enemy's war production without needing to invade and occupy their territory had driven American air doctrine for 2 decades, though the technology to implement this strategy effectively had always lagged behind the theory. The B-29 was meant to close that gap, creating a bomber that could reach any target, survive the journey despite enemy opposition, deliver its bombs with sufficient accuracy to destroy specific industrial facilities, and return home to repeat the mission day after day until the enemy's capacity to wage war simply ceased to exist. Japanese geography made the empire particularly vulnerable to this approach. The home islands contained virtually all of Japan's heavy industry: aircraft production, oil refining, and weapons manufacturing, concentrated in major urban areas that were identifiable targets impossible to camouflage or move. Unlike Germany, which could potentially relocate factories or disperse production, Japan's limited land area and dependence on specific industrial centers meant that successful strategic bombing would have nowhere to hide from its effects. The Japanese air defense system that existed in late 1944 was sophisticated and had proven effective against the threats it was designed to counter. But those threats didn't include anything like the B-29. Japanese engineers and military planners had studied German air defense systems, incorporated radar technology, and created an integrated network of early warning stations, fighter bases, anti-aircraft artillery positions, searchlight batteries, and civil defense organizations involving millions of trained civilians. This system had successfully defended against Chinese bomber raids, which used aircraft that were slow, low-flying, and carried minimal bomb loads. It had also proven adequate against the relatively few American B-24 and B-25 raids launched from distant bases in China, aircraft that had to fly at medium altitudes, where Japanese fighters could engage them effectively, and where anti-aircraft fire was accurate enough to achieve reasonable hit probabilities. The system assumed that bombers would need to fly at altitudes between 15,000 and 25,000 feet to achieve any bombing accuracy, that their defensive armament would be limited to a few machine guns manually operated by exposed gunners, and that their speed would be comparable to or slower than Japanese fighter aircraft, allowing interceptors time to climb to altitude, position themselves for attacks, and make multiple passes if necessary. Every element of Japanese air defense, from the service ceiling of their fighters to the maximum elevation of their anti-aircraft guns, had been optimized for these assumptions. The arrival of the B-29 invalidated every single one of them simultaneously. The altitude advantage alone would have been sufficient to create serious problems for Japanese defenses, but it was just the first of multiple overwhelming advantages. Most Japanese fighters, including the vaunted Zero, which had dominated early Pacific air combat, had service ceilings between 33,000 and 35,000 feet on paper, but those numbers represented absolute maximum altitude achieved under ideal conditions, with minimal fuel and no weapons load. In combat configuration with full ammunition, drop tanks for extended range, and the need to actually maneuver rather than simply fly straight and level, Japanese fighters struggled to reach 25,000 feet, and anything above that altitude saw their performance degrade catastrophically. Engine power decreased with altitude as air density dropped, meaning that fighters climbing to 27,000 or 28,000 feet to intercept B-29s at 30,000 feet were operating at the absolute edge of their performance envelope, where any aggressive maneuvering risked stalling, and where oxygen deprivation affected pilot judgment, even with oxygen equipment functioning properly. Japanese pilots described the experience of trying to intercept B-29s at altitude as fighting while underwater. Controls became mushy and unresponsive. Turn radius widened until tight maneuvering was impossible. Speed bled off alarmingly in any climbing turn, and the physical exhaustion of operating in thin air with marginal oxygen supply left pilots mentally sluggish at exactly the moment when split-second decisions meant the difference between successful attacks and failure. The time required for Japanese fighters to climb from ground level to B-29 altitude was another critical factor that American planners exploited ruthlessly. Climbing to 30,000 feet took Japanese interceptors between 20 and 30 minutes, depending on aircraft type and pilot skill. And during that entire climb, they were burning fuel at high rates, while American early warning gave B-29 formations advance notice of fighter response. By the time Japanese fighters reached interception altitude, B-29s had often already dropped their bombs and were heading home, or the formations were positioned such that fighters had only one chance for a single pass before the bombers flew beyond range. The speed equation created additional problems that Japanese air defense commanders had no good solution for. The B-29's cruising speed of 290 miles per hour at altitude was faster than the maximum speed of many Japanese fighters at 30,000 feet. where thin air reduced engine performance and propeller efficiency. This meant that Japanese fighters couldn't execute the classic tail chase that had been standard fighter tactics against slower bombers, closing from behind to a position where the fighter could fire without the bomber being able to return effective fire. Against B-29s, tail chases at altitude were nearly impossible because the bomber could maintain or even increase its speed advantage by shallow diving, forcing Japanese fighters to follow in a descent where they gained speed but also lost altitude, eventually having to break off as the B-29 leveled out and the fighter found itself too low to continue the engagement. Head-on attacks, the alternative approach that some Japanese pilots adopted, gave fighters only seconds of firing time as the closing speed between fighter and bomber approached 600 miles per hour, meaning that a pilot had perhaps 2 to 3 seconds to aim, fire, and break away before collision became inevitable. Most pilots, even experienced ones, couldn't achieve effective hits in such brief engagement windows, and those who did press attacks too aggressively sometimes collided with B-29s or passed so close to the bomber formations that turbulence from other aircraft threw their fighters out of control. The range revolution that the B-29 represented completely negated what had been Japan's most fundamental strategic defense, geographic isolation. For 3 years, Japan's home islands had been essentially invulnerable to strategic bombing, because no Allied bomber could reach them from secure bases. The distances were simply too great for existing aircraft to fly combat missions and return. The B-29's combat radius of 1,600 miles with a 5,000-pound bomb load meant that the Marianas bases, which Japan had failed to hold despite fierce resistance, put Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, and virtually every major Japanese city within range of sustained bombing campaigns. Japanese strategic planning had always assumed that distance would force any invasion to begin with island conquests much closer to Japan, giving Japanese forces time to prepare defenses and wear down American forces through attrition. The B-29 bypassed this entire strategic calculation, striking directly at Japan's industrial heart from bases that Japanese forces couldn't effectively counterattack because they lacked the naval power and air superiority needed to project force across 1,500 miles of ocean. The initial high-altitude precision bombing campaign that began in November 1944 represented the orthodox application of American strategic bombing doctrine, attacking specific industrial targets from altitudes where defensive fire would be minimized, and where the Norden bomb sight, that supposedly miraculous device that could supposedly drop bombs into pickle barrels from miles up, would have the time and stability to achieve the pinpoint accuracy that pre-war theorists had promised. The first mission against Tokyo on November 24, 1944, involved 111 B-29s attacking the Musashino aircraft engine plant, flying at altitudes between 27,000 and 33,000 feet, releasing their bombs through partly cloudy skies, while Japanese fighters made desperate and largely ineffective attempts to intercept formations that were flying higher and faster than most defenders could effectively engage. The results were disappointing in terms of actual damage to the target. Fewer than 10% of bombs fell within the factory complex, the rest scattering across Tokyo due to a combination of cloud cover obscuring the target. Winds aloft that were far stronger than American meteorologists had predicted, and the simple reality that precision bombing from 6 miles up was far more difficult than peacetime tests had suggested. But the psychological impact was enormous for both attackers and defenders. American crews realized they could fly over Japan's capital city, the home of the emperor himself, and Japanese defenses could do little to stop them, while Japanese military leadership confronted the terrifying reality that their air defense system, which they had believed was adequate, couldn't prevent American bombers from operating almost at will over the most heavily defended airspace in the empire. Japanese response to these early high-altitude raids revealed both determination and growing desperation as commanders threw every available fighter into attempts to stop the B-29s, despite the obvious futility of many intercept attempts. Pilots scrambled to maximum altitude, their aircraft struggling in thin air, oxygen systems working overtime to keep pilots conscious while they tried to position themselves for attacks against formations of silver giants that seemed to hang effortlessly in the stratosphere. Some pilots attempted conventional gun attacks, closing to firing range of 200 to 300 yards and opening fire with their 7.7mm and 20mm cannons, only to discover that B-29 defensive armament was far more effective than they'd expected, with American gunners directing computer-controlled turrets that tracked attacking fighters and put streams of 50 caliber bullets into approach paths with accuracy that Japanese pilots found shocking. The B-29s didn't fight like other bombers these pilots had encountered. They didn't fly helplessly waiting to be shot down. They shot back with devastating effectiveness, and Japanese fighter units began suffering casualties in intercept attempts that exceeded the number of B-29s they managed to shoot down. Desperate tactics emerged as pilots recognized that conventional attacks weren't working. Aerial ramming became a grimly accepted tactic for some units whose commanders told pilots that sacrificing themselves to destroy B-29s was honorable and necessary. Though even these suicide attacks often failed, as B-29s proved sturdy enough to survive collisions that destroyed lighter Japanese fighters. Anti-aircraft artillery, the other pillar of Japan's air defense system, fired massive barrages at B-29 formations, filling the sky with exploding shells that created the appearance of effective defense but achieved remarkably few actual hits against aircraft flying at altitudes where gun accuracy degraded significantly and where predicted trajectories had to account for shells traveling through air densities that changed dramatically between launch and target altitude. The tactical revolution that transformed the B-29 campaign from disappointing high-altitude precision bombing to devastating low-altitude area attacks came in March 1945, when General Curtis LeMay, who had taken command of Santisil Bomber Command in January, made one of the most controversial decisions of the Pacific War. LeMay's analysis of the bombing campaign's results showed that high-altitude precision attacks weren't destroying enough Japanese industrial capacity fast enough. That accuracy was poor due to weather and jet stream winds, and that the campaign, at its current pace, would take years to achieve decisive results. His solution was radical, revolutionary, and contradicted virtually everything in American strategic bombing doctrine. Switch from daytime high-altitude precision attacks with high-explosive bombs to nighttime low-altitude area attacks with incendiary bombs. Remove most of the defensive armament from B-29s to increase bomb loads, and deliberately target Japanese urban areas rather than specific factories. The logic was brutal but compelling. Japanese industry wasn't concentrated in a few large factories that could be destroyed individually. It was dispersed throughout urban areas in thousands of small workshops and plants where components were manufactured, and destroying the urban infrastructure would eliminate industrial capacity more effectively than trying to hit individual targets. Japanese cities, built largely of wood and paper construction materials, would burn catastrophically if attacked with incendiaries, and nighttime attacks at lower altitudes would catch defenders unprepared and reduce the bombing accuracy problems that plagued high-altitude missions. Removing defensive guns would increase bomb loads by up to 30%, and LeMay's analysis suggested that Japanese night fighters weren't effective enough to justify the weight penalty of carrying full armament. The implementation of this new strategy on the night of March 9 to 10, 1945, produced Operation Meeting House, the single most destructive air raid in human history, and the moment when Japanese air defenses were revealed as completely inadequate to protect the population. 334 B-29s took off from Marianas bases in late afternoon, timed to arrive over Tokyo after midnight, when most of the city would be asleep, and when Japanese night fighter capability would be at its weakest. Each aircraft carried between 6 and 8 tons of incendiary bombs, mostly M69 cluster munitions, that released individual bomblets filled with napalm designed to start fires that water couldn't extinguish. The formations flew at altitudes between 5,000 and 8,000 feet, low enough that bomb accuracy improved dramatically, and low enough that the freezing temperatures at high altitude didn't affect crew efficiency, though also low enough that anti-aircraft fire was more dangerous and fighter attacks potentially more effective. Pathfinder aircraft went in first, dropping napalm bombs to mark target zones, with fires that subsequent waves would use as aiming points, creating a systematic pattern of fire that would spread across Tokyo's densely packed neighborhoods like a wave of destruction advancing at walking speed. The follow-up waves arrived at intervals calculated to catch firefighting efforts at their peak of exhaustion, dropping more incendiaries onto areas where fires were already burning and overwhelming the capacity of Japanese civil defense organizations to respond. Japanese air defenses on that night were completely overwhelmed by the scale and nature of the attack in ways that revealed how unprepared they were for this type of warfare. Fighter controllers, accustomed to daytime interceptions where visual identification was easy and where attacking formations flew at predictable altitudes, struggled to coordinate responses when radar showed formations of B-29s scattered across different altitudes and approaching from multiple directions. Night fighters, the specialized units trained and equipped for darkness operations, found their task nearly impossible as smoke from the rapidly spreading fires reduced visibility to near zero, and as the thermal updrafts from the firestorm created turbulence so severe that aircraft at low altitude risked being thrown out of control. Anti-aircraft gunners fired at targets they could barely see, their shells exploding in smoke-filled skies where determining whether hits were achieved was nearly impossible, and their rate of fire was limited by the need to avoid hitting the increasingly numerous friendly fighters that were attempting to engage the bombers. The few Japanese fighters that did manage to engage B-29s at low altitude found themselves facing aircraft that, even without most of their defensive armament, could still outrun most Japanese fighters at that altitude and could maneuver more effectively than the Japanese had expected. American crews, flying through smoke and turbulence and occasional fighter attacks, maintained their bombing runs with discipline that impressed even themselves, bombardiers releasing their loads over the marked target zones while pilots fought to keep their aircraft stable in conditions that resembled flying through a thunderstorm. The devastation on the ground exceeded anything that military planners on either side had anticipated or believed possible from conventional bombing. The initial fires from the Pathfinder aircraft spread rapidly through Tokyo's wooden structures, fanned by moderate winds that proved perfect for creating a firestorm, the meteorological phenomenon where multiple fires combine to create a self-sustaining conflagration that generates its own winds through thermal convection. Within an hour of the attack beginning, ground winds in the target area exceeded 30 miles per hour, driven entirely by the heat of the fires, pulling oxygen into the burning areas and making firefighting not just difficult but physically impossible. Temperatures in the firestorm reached 1800 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough that people caught in the open were killed by radiant heat before flames reached them. Hot enough that canals and rivers offered no protection, as superheated air above the water killed people trying to escape by swimming. 16 square miles of Tokyo, an area containing one of the highest population densities on Earth, burned in a single night, destroying over 267,000 buildings and killing an estimated 100,000 people, more deaths than either atomic bomb would later cause. The fires were so intense that B-29 crews flying through the smoke at 5,000 feet reported smelling burning flesh, an odor so distinctive and horrifying that many crew members became physically ill, despite being miles above the destruction. The systematic destruction of Japanese cities that followed the Tokyo firebombing demonstrated with brutal clarity that Japanese air defenses had become completely irrelevant to the outcome of the air war. Between March and August 1945, LeMay's XT-1 Bomber Command worked methodically down a target list that included 67 Japanese cities, moving from the largest urban centers to progressively smaller ones, each receiving multiple raids until American reconnaissance photos showed them effectively destroyed. The numbers told a story of mounting helplessness that Japanese military commanders couldn't hide from their civilian leadership. Nagoya, Japan's third-largest city and a major aircraft production center, lost 3.6 square miles to firebombing on March 11-12, with its Mitsubishi aircraft plants reduced to twisted metal and ash. Osaka, the second-largest city and crucial port, saw 8.1 square miles burned on March 13-14, destroying critical industrial facilities and transportation infrastructure. Kobe followed on March 16-17, its shipbuilding capacity eliminated in a single night. Each raid followed the same pattern, Pathfinders marking targets, main force saturating the area with incendiaries, Japanese defenses achieving token kills while the bombers operated with near impunity. Yokohama suffered devastation on May 29th, when its port facilities and industrial areas were obliterated in a raid that left the city's capacity to support naval operations essentially destroyed. Each successful raid reinforced the lesson that Japanese air defenses couldn't protect their cities, couldn't stop the bombers, and couldn't prevent the systematic elimination of Japan's war-making capacity. Japanese fighter response degraded with each passing week as the cumulative effects of the campaign destroyed not just cities but the ability to maintain air defense operations. Pilot casualties mounted unsustainably as experienced aviators died in futile intercept attempts, their places taken by barely trained replacements who had perhaps 50 hours of flight time compared to the 200 hours of training that pre-war pilots received. These undertrained pilots were being asked to fly complex intercepts against formations of bombers that flew faster and higher than their training had prepared them for, often at night or in weather conditions that would have challenged veteran pilots. And the results were predictable. Fuel shortages caused by B-29 strikes on oil refineries and storage facilities combined with American submarine warfare that cut off oil imports from the East Indies meant that fighters often couldn't launch at all, remaining grounded while bombers destroyed cities overhead. Japanese commanders faced the impossible choice of husbanding their remaining fuel for the anticipated American invasion or expending it in defensive operations that achieved minimal results, and increasingly, they chose to preserve resources rather than waste them on ineffective intercepts. Ammunition stocks depleted faster than factories could produce replacements, particularly the specialized shells designed for high-altitude combat, forcing anti-aircraft batteries to ration their fire and sometimes cease firing altogether during raids. Aircraft production, the industry that was supposed to provide replacement fighters, collapsed as the raids destroyed not just final assembly plants, but the network of small suppliers producing engines, instruments, and components. Japanese industry had never been truly mass production-oriented like American manufacturing, relying instead on skilled craftsmen, creating precision parts in small workshops scattered throughout urban areas, exactly the type of production that area bombing destroyed most effectively. When a firebombing raid burned through a neighborhood, it didn't just kill residents, it eliminated dozens of small machine shops that produced aircraft components, destroyed the craftsmen who had the skills to make precision parts, and severed supply chains that couldn't be quickly reconstituted. The mining campaign that B-29s conducted simultaneously with the firebombing raids demonstrated the aircraft's versatility and added another dimension to Japan's strategic paralysis that received less attention than the dramatic city destruction, but was equally devastating in its effects. Operation Starvation involved B-29s dropping thousands of acoustic and magnetic mines in Japanese harbors, shipping channels, and the Shimonoseki Strait, the crucial waterway connecting Japan's main islands and the only route for shipping between the Sea of Japan and the Pacific Ocean. These missions, flown at night at very low altitudes over water, were among the most dangerous B-29 operations because they required precise navigation to specific drop points and exposed aircraft to coastal anti-aircraft fire while they flew slow and level during mine drops, making the aircraft vulnerable in ways that high-altitude bombing missions didn't. Japanese mine-sweeping capability proved completely inadequate for the scale of mining that Americans implemented, which eventually laid over 12,000 mines in strategic waters and reduced Japanese shipping to a fraction of previous levels within months. The strategic impact of Operation Starvation rivaled the direct bombing in importance to Japan's collapse. The entire Japanese war economy and civilian population depended critically on imports of food from Korea and Manchuria, raw materials from occupied territories in Southeast Asia, and what little oil still reached Japan from the East Indies despite American submarine interdiction. When merchant shipping effectively stopped due to mine threat, with captains refusing to sail and ships being sunk at rates that made replacement impossible, the entire economy began collapsing, even beyond the direct destruction from bombing raids. By summer 1945, Japanese food imports had dropped 80% from previous years, creating genuine starvation conditions in cities where rice rations were cut repeatedly and where black market prices made food unaffordable for ordinary citizens. Steel production was crippled by inability to import coal and iron ore, the raw materials that Japanese industry depended on because the home islands lacked adequate domestic sources. Military forces on the home islands were increasingly cut off from units still fighting in China, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific Islands, unable to receive reinforcements or supplies and unable to retreat because the sea lanes were too dangerous to risk troop transports. Fighter escort operations began in April 1945, when P-51 Mustangs based on Iwo Jima, captured after brutal fighting in February and March specifically to provide a base within escort range of Japan, started accompanying B-29 raids and added yet another insurmountable layer to Japanese air defense woes. Japanese fighter pilots now faced a situation where engaging B-29s meant first fighting through escorts that were superior in speed, maneuverability, and pilot skill to anything Japan could field in 1945. With American pilots, who had often accumulated hundreds of hours of combat experience against German and Japanese opposition, the Mustangs operated at altitudes where they dominated Japanese interceptors completely. The P-51's performance at 25,000 to 30,000 feet exceeded that of Japanese fighters by such wide margins that encounters were less like dogfights and more like massacres. Japanese pilots attempting to reach the B-29 formations had to fight through the Mustang screen, and most never made it, being shot down or forced to break off before they could attack the bombers. This created a defensive barrier that made the B-29s virtually invulnerable, except to the most determined and skillful. Japanese pilots who were willing to accept near-certain death to make a single attack pass. American fighter superiority became so absolute that P-51s began conducting offensive sweeps over Japan, attacking airfields and destroying Japanese aircraft on the ground, further degrading already crippled air defense capability by destroying planes before they could even attempt to intercept bombers. Japanese fighter units shifted to preservation mode, hiding aircraft in caves, forests, and camouflaged revetments to prevent their destruction on the ground, dispersing them to small auxiliary airfields where American reconnaissance was less likely to find them. The preserved aircraft that never flew achieved nothing militarily. They represented only potential capability rather than actual defense, and the strategic effect was the same as if they'd been destroyed. By July 1945, Japanese air opposition to B-29 raids had diminished to the point where some missions encountered no fighter attacks whatsoever, and anti-aircraft fire had become sporadic due to ammunition shortages and deliberate conservation for the anticipated invasion. The atomic bomb missions flown by B-29's Enola Gay against Hiroshima and Bockscar against Nagasaki represented the ultimate demonstration of Japanese air defense obsolescence. Single aircraft flying at high altitude, delivering weapons that would change warfare forever, conducting their missions without fighter escort because American commanders had such complete confidence that Japanese defenses couldn't stop them. The Hiroshima mission on August 6th involved just 3 B-29s, the bomber carrying the weapon and 2 observation aircraft carrying cameras and scientific instruments to record the detonation. Flying at 31,000 feet, when Colonel Paul Tibbets released the bomb nicknamed Little Boy, and Japanese air defenses never effectively engaged them despite clear weather and advance warning from radar stations that had detected the small formation approaching. Nagasaki followed on August 9th under similar conditions, though with worse weather that forced the crew to use their secondary target. And again, Japanese fighters attempted interception, but arrived too late to prevent the mission, and the bomb detonated before defenses could respond meaningfully. The fact that these missions, carrying weapons of unprecedented destructive power, whose detonation would kill tens of thousands instantly and doom tens of thousands more to death from radiation, could be conducted with such minimal American losses and such ineffective Japanese opposition, summarized everything that had happened to Japanese air defenses over the preceding 10 months of B-29 operations. The same aircraft that had been burning Japanese cities with conventional incendiaries for months delivered nuclear weapons using exactly the same tactical approach. High-altitude bombing from B-29s that Japanese defenses simply couldn't stop, regardless of the importance of the target or the desperation of the defense. And the technological and tactical superiority that made the conventional firebombing campaign unstoppable also made the atomic missions inevitable. Successes from the moment they launched. Individual B-29 crew experiences throughout the campaign illustrated the transformation from genuinely dangerous combat missions where losses ran to 5 or 10% of attacking forces to operations that, while never completely safe because mechanical failures and occasional lucky hits still killed crews, became progressively less lethal as Japanese defenses collapsed under the weight of attrition and resource depletion. Pilots flying their first missions in late 1944 and early 1945 faced determined fighter opposition that sometimes resulted in running battles lasting 30 minutes or more. With Japanese pilots making repeated attack runs and demonstrating the skill and courage that had made them formidable opponents earlier in the war. Those same pilots flying their 30th missions in summer 1945 reported encountering little or no opposition, watching Japanese cities burn thousands of feet below them with a mixture of professional satisfaction at mission, success and growing psychological discomfort at the human cost of area bombing that was killing civilians by the tens of thousands in single raids. Some crew members struggled with the moral implications of what they were doing, burning entire cities where they knew women and children lived, while others rationalized it as necessary to end the war and save the lives of American soldiers who would otherwise have to invade Japan. Gunners who had frantically tracked attacking fighters during early missions, their hands cramped from gripping fire controls, and their eyes strained from scanning empty sky for the tiny dots that indicated incoming fighters, found themselves with nothing to shoot at during later raids, Japanese fighters appearing so rarely that some gunners completed entire 30-mission tours without ever firing their weapons in combat. The psychological impact of this strange reversal, training extensively for aerial combat and then never experiencing it, left some gunners feeling oddly cheated or wondering if they'd really participated in the war at all. Bombardiers achieved increasingly accurate results as opposition decreased and as they gained experience with the peculiarities of bombing Japanese targets, learning to account for local weather patterns and developing techniques for marking targets that improved the effectiveness of follow-up waves. The view from the bombardier's position during firebombing raids was unforgettable for those who experienced it, watching the initial fires from Pathfinder bombs spread rapidly across densely packed neighborhoods, seeing the glow intensify as subsequent waves added more incendiaries, and sometimes witnessing the development of firestorms that created smoke columns visible for 100 miles, and that glowed so brightly they illuminated the B-29s flying miles above. The statistical devastation that B-29 operations inflicted on Japan between November 1944 and August 1945 told a story of systematic destruction that exceeded what any nation had experienced from aerial bombardment and demonstrated conclusively that Japanese air defenses had become meaningless in preventing the annihilation of their industrial capacity and urban infrastructure. American B-29s flew approximately 33,000 sorties against Japanese targets during this 10-month period, dropping 147,000 tons of bombs, not counting the 2 atomic weapons, and this tonnage represented more explosive and incendiary power than Japan had experienced in the entire war prior to the B-29's arrival. 67 Japanese cities received significant damage or complete destruction, with 40% of urban area in targeted cities burned to ash and rubble, leaving millions of Japanese civilians homeless and destroying the workshops, factories and infrastructure that sustained Japan's war economy. The human cost was staggering, with estimates of 330,000 Japanese civilians killed by conventional bombing alone, a number that exceeded American combat deaths in the entire Pacific War and demonstrated the terrible effectiveness of strategic bombing against urban targets. Japanese industrial production, which had peaked in 1944, collapsed to approximately 10% of previous capacity by August 1945, with aircraft production dropping 70%, steel output reduced to a fraction of requirements, and oil refining essentially ceased as refineries burned and imports stopped. The Japanese lost approximately 12,000 aircraft destroyed, either in combat with B-29s and their escorts or on the ground during airfield attacks, representing not just material loss, but the elimination of experienced pilots and maintenance personnel who couldn't be replaced. Against this devastating effectiveness, American losses were remarkably light given the scale of operations. Fewer than 500 B-29s lost to all causes over Japan, and even accounting for the aircraft, lost to mechanical failures and operational accidents. The loss rate per sortie was significantly lower than what American bombers experienced over Germany, validating the B-29's design superiority and the obsolescence of Japanese defenses. What made Japanese air defenses obsolete wasn't a single factor, but the combination of multiple overwhelming advantages that the B-29 possessed simultaneously. Advantages that Japanese technology and tactics in 1945 simply had no effective counter, for regardless of how skilled their pilots were or how determined their defense. The altitude advantage was impossible to overcome with existing Japanese fighters, whose service ceilings were marginal for intercepting B-29s operating at 30,000 feet. And even when Japanese pilots did reach interception altitude, their aircraft performed so poorly in thin air that effective attacks were nearly impossible, and each attempt risked the pilot's life for minimal chance of success. The speed differential at altitude meant that Japanese fighters couldn't execute the tail chase attacks that had been standard bomber interception tactics throughout aviation history, and the brief engagement windows available during head-on passes required perfect gunnery under conditions where most pilots simply couldn't achieve hits. The range capability that allowed B-29s to strike from the Marianas meant that Japan's geographic isolation, which had protected the home islands for 3 years, became irrelevant overnight once Saipan and Tinian were captured and turned into massive air bases. Their defensive armament with computer-controlled turrets and interlocking fields of fire made every approach angle dangerous for Japanese fighters, eliminating the safe attack positions that had existed against earlier bombers. Most fundamentally, the scale of American operations and the industrial capacity that allowed replacement of losses faster than Japan could inflict them meant that even when Japanese defenses achieved local successes, the strategic impact was negligible because more B-29s arrived the next night and the night after that in numbers that couldn't be stopped. Japanese post-war military analysis, conducted with the brutal honesty that defeat sometimes permits, acknowledged complete failure to develop effective countermeasures against the B-29 and recognized that no realistic defensive improvements could have changed the outcome given Japan's resource limitations and technological gap. Japanese officers who had commanded air defense units wrote after the war that they had known by spring 1945 that defending against B-29 raids was futile, that they were ordering pilots to their deaths in intercept attempts that couldn't save the cities below, and that the only question was how long Japan could endure the destruction before surrendering. Some analyses focused on specific technical failures: the inadequate service ceiling of Japanese fighters, the shortage of high-altitude engines, the lack of effective radar-directed night fighters. But the more sophisticated assessments recognized that these were symptoms of a larger problem. Japan's industrial and technological base was simply too limited to compete with American engineering and manufacturing capacity. Even if Japan had developed better fighters, they couldn't produce them in sufficient numbers, couldn't train pilots adequately due to fuel shortages, and couldn't maintain complex aircraft with the limited supplies available. The recognition that strategic bombing had achieved its objectives, destroying Japan's capacity to continue the war, regardless of military forces still in the field, influenced Japanese military doctrine in the post-war period and contributed to Japan's decision never to develop strategic bombing capability of its own, focusing instead on defensive forces. B-29 crew survivors' accounts, collected in the decades after the war, revealed complex and often contradictory feelings about their role in the campaign, with pride in their technical achievement and contribution to victory mixed with discomfort about the civilian casualties that area bombing inevitably caused. Veterans described the B-29 as the finest aircraft they ever flew, praising its comfort, performance, and the confidence they felt in its capabilities. But many struggled with memories of watching cities burn below them and knowing that thousands were dying in those fires. Some crew members never reconciled themselves to the firebombing campaign, viewing it as morally wrong despite its military effectiveness, while others maintained that it was necessary to end the war and save lives that an invasion would have cost. The bonds formed between crew members proved extraordinarily strong and enduring, with B-29 veteran organizations remaining active into the 21st century and annual reunions continuing as long as survivors lived. Japanese perspectives on the bombing campaign, from both civilians who survived the raids and military personnel who tried to defend against them, emphasized the psychological impact of helplessness, watching the bombers overhead and knowing that nothing could stop them, waiting to see if tonight would be when your neighborhood burned. Many Japanese survivors drew distinctions between the conventional firebombing and the atomic bombs, viewing the incendiary raids as more terrifying because they lasted hours and gave people time to experience the horror of the firestorm. While the atomic bombs at least killed instantly, the strategic impact that the B-29 campaign had on ending the Pacific War remains debated by historians. But there's no question that it made Japan's position hopeless well before the atomic bombs fell, and that it influenced the Japanese decision to surrender by demonstrating that continued resistance would result in complete destruction of their cities and starvation of their population. The systematic elimination of industrial capacity meant that even if Japan's military forces remained intact, they couldn't be supplied, armed, or sustained without the factories and transportation networks that bombing destroyed. The mining campaign's strangulation of imports meant that Japanese civilians faced genuine starvation by late summer 1945, with food rations cut to levels below subsistence and no prospect of improvement. The firebombing's psychological impact on Japanese leadership, particularly Emperor Hirohito, who viewed bombed areas personally and was deeply affected by the suffering of his people, contributed to his unprecedented decision to intervene in military decisions and order surrender, despite opposition from some military leaders who wanted to continue fighting. The atomic bombs provided a face-saving excuse for surrender, allowing Japanese leaders to claim they were yielding to an unprecedented new weapon rather than admitting they were defeated by conventional bombing and blockade. But the strategic situation created by B-29 operations had already made surrender inevitable. The technological legacy of the B-29 extended far beyond its immediate military success and influenced both military and civilian aviation for decades afterward, establishing design principles and performance benchmarks that shaped the entire post-war aerospace industry. B-29 pressurization technology became standard in all subsequent transport and bomber aircraft, making high-altitude flight comfortable and practical for crews and passengers and enabling the commercial jet age that followed. Remote weapon systems and fire control computers developed for the B-29 influenced modern aircraft design and evolved into the sophisticated defensive systems on military aircraft today. The range and payload capabilities that seemed extraordinary in 1944 set goals for successor aircraft like the B-36 and B-52, which would dominate American strategic bombing for the Cold War era. Boeing's experience manufacturing and supporting the B-29 gave them expertise in large aircraft production that led directly to the 707. Commercial jet and established Boeing as the dominant commercial aircraft manufacturer, making the B-29 the ancestor of every Boeing jetliner flying today. The strategic bombing doctrine that the B-29 seemed to validate, that air power could win wars without ground invasion, influenced American military thinking throughout the Cold War and led to massive investments in bomber forces and nuclear weapons designed to deter Soviet aggression through threat of strategic bombing. In the end, the B-29 Superfortress revealed a fundamental truth about modern warfare that Japanese air defense commanders learned at terrible cost to their nation and their people. That revolutionary technology can render years of military preparation obsolete overnight when the gap between adversaries becomes wide enough, and that sometimes courage, determination, and tactical skill cannot overcome fundamental disadvantages in capability and resources. The Japanese had built an air defense system that was sophisticated by mid-war standards and effective against conventional bombers. with thousands of anti-aircraft guns positioned around every major city, hundreds of fighters whose pilots were willing to die to protect their homeland, and millions of citizens trained in fire defense and organized to respond to air raids. But none of it mattered when the B-29s appeared overhead, flying too high for most fighters to reach effectively, too fast to intercept reliably, even when fighters did reach altitude, too heavily armed to attack safely from any angle, and arriving in formations too large to stop, even when everything worked perfectly for the defenders. Japanese pilots made desperate attacks that often ended in their deaths. Anti-aircraft gunners fired thousands of shells until their ammunition ran out, and their cities burned anyway. And civilians fought fires with buckets and wet blankets until the firestorms overwhelmed them and their neighborhoods turned to ash. The outcome was never seriously in doubt once the Marianas bases became operational and B-29s began arriving in numbers sufficient for sustained operations. The B-29 wasn't just a marginally better bomber than what had come before. It was a revolutionary weapon system that represented such a quantum leap in capability that existing defenses became obsolete the moment it entered service. And by the time Japan could theoretically have developed effective countermeasures through crash programs to build better fighters and improve defensive systems, their cities were destroyed, their industrial capacity was eliminated, and their ability to continue the war had ceased to exist. Japanese air defenses didn't fail because of incompetence or lack of courage. They had brave pilots and competent commanders who did everything possible with the resources available. They failed because American engineering had created something that simply couldn't be stopped with 1940s technology and limited Japanese industrial capacity. And that reality, more than diplomatic negotiations or individual battles, made Japan's continued resistance futile and their eventual surrender after the atomic bombs merely the formal acknowledgement of a defeat that B-29 operations had already made inevitable.